Thank you, Tom. It's a little intimidating to be here, but this is where 30 plus years ago I used to come to get some sanctuary when I was a Duke undergrad. And so it's very nice to be back. It's very nice to know that it is still here in an age when, of course, there are very few independent bookstores and very few chain bookstores, very few bookstores of any kind, diminishing supply of writers and publications. It really is nice to see you all out here. I know you're not all here because you're readers. I have a feeling there might be some other agendas, but I'm okay with that, and I want to, sort of embrace that, and I want to talk a little bit about this book and put it in the context. And normally what I might do with my books is maybe tell some stories from the book, anecdotes, but I have a feeling most of you are pretty familiar with the story. So what I wanted to do instead is talk about this book, why I wrote it, what it means to me, what it should mean to all of us. This is a story that attracted enormous attention at the time, because it involves large critical issues: the conflict of race, class, and gender, the outsized influence of sports in our universities, and the privilege and resentment that go with it, the role that money and influence and politics play in the justice system, the distorting demands of the 24/7 news cycle, and the two flashpoints that dominate American popular culture: sex and violence, flavored with that great accelerator, alcohol. This was a drama with flawed main characters, none of whom covered himself or herself in glory. We begin with the Duke lacrosse players, whose clannishness, out-of-control drinking, sense of entitlement, and boorish, sexist, and in the case of some, racist behavior set the tone and created the incident for all that followed. There was the accuser, whose checkered legal and mental health history — I note that she once upon a time used to be referred to as a victim, but now she's of course known as the accuser — whose legal and mental history and whose changing versions of what occurred at the house that night made her less than an ideal witness. There were the Durham police, whose objectivity can be questioned. One officer in particular was clearly out to, quote, get Dukies, and whose methodology in investigating the case left much to be desired. There was Mike Nifong, the Durham DA, who early in the investigation spoke inappropriately and indiscriminately to the public about the presumed guilt of the players, and whose Ahab-like quest to find them guilty led to a poor investigation at best, and a suppression of exculpatory evidence at worst. And there were the Duke administrators, who on the one hand looked the other way as the, quote, work hard, play hard frat hookup culture grew up around them with its great reverence for athletes and coaches, and who on the other hand were terribly protective of Duke's public image. The Duke administrators, along with much of the public, rushed to judgment early on, presuming the guilt of the players, canceling the season, firing the coach, and shunning the players. Then, as the winds shifted, they went 180 degrees in the other direction, barely months later, going out of their way to paper over differences with the players, even to the tune of an estimated $60 million settlement and $100 million in overall cost. This was the story of a rush to judgment first against the players, and only months later against the accuser and the DA. We'll never know what exactly went on in that bathroom on the night of March 13, 2006, but it's fair to say that the weight of public opinion and the press of a team of highly compensated defense attorneys took what had been a viable criminal court case and snuffed it out before the accuser could have her day in court and before the DA could raise legitimate questions about the actions of the players. This case illustrates some troubling trends in higher education and in society. Yes, this is about Duke, but it's also about universities across the country where the highest paid employee by far is the football or basketball coach, and where there are separate sets of rules for athletes and the rest of us. This is hardly the only place in America where access to expensive lawyers or being poor and a person of color plays an outsized role in determining guilt or innocence. This is not the only place where underage drinking is tolerated and accepted until there are tragic consequences, where class and racial barriers predetermine attitudes and opinions, and where the 24/7 news coverage whips people into an uninformed frenzy, a frenzy that continues to this day. The easiest thing for me to do would have been to write a fourth book about Wall Street. That's what my publisher wanted me to do. But I didn't want to do that. I was struck by this case from afar in New York, where I live. I kept up with the media reports on this on a relatively regular basis. And I remember getting whipsawed by the coverage. 1 minute thinking that these kids were guilty as sin, another minute thinking they were angelic. And I wanted to get to the bottom of it. I wanted to know what happened in as dispassionate way as I could muster. I was trained at Duke as a historian, and then afterward as an investigative reporter in Raleigh. Twice I won investigative reporting awards in the state for articles I wrote in the 1980s about corruption in the Wake County school system. I then went on to business school and spent 17 years on Wall Street. In the last 10 years, I've written 4 books. Tomes, some have said. The first was about Lazard Frères, which was an investment bank in New York where I worked, which won the Financial Times, Goldman Sachs Business Book of the Year award, as Tom pointed out. I beat out Alan Greenspan for that award. In fact, Alan Greenspan was on his way to London, where the ceremony was taking place, and he was in a private jet coming over, and somehow they got him the word that he had lost and I had won, and his plane turned around and flew back to New York, I believe, or Washington. I believe that's a true story. It could be apocryphal. I'm a contributing writer, contributing editor at Vanity Fair. I write for Business Week. I write for The Atlantic. I write for Art News. I write for the New York Times Magazine. I write for the New York Times. I write for the New York Times opinion page. I write for Bloomberg View. I went out of my way to be scrupulously fair and balanced in the writing of this book. I gave everybody who wanted to be heard the chance to talk to me at length, and I faithfully reproduced our conversations. Those conversations, most notably, obviously, included conversations with Crystal Mangum, who I interviewed in the Durham County Jail while she was awaiting her trial for murder, which occurred last November. I spent hours with Mike Nifong, who many people consider the devil incarnate, but I found to be honorable, reasonable, open, truthful, and very anxious to tell his version of the story for the first time. Not in an uncontested way, as the News and Observer would have you believe. The whole book is a contesting of Mike Nifong and everything he did. So I thought it was proper and right and balanced as an investigative reporter to give him the chance to talk to me and to record faithfully what he said, especially since he was willing to do so. I also spoke to Bob Steele, the chairman of the board of Duke University, during this crisis. Duke University told Bob Steele not to talk to me, but he did it anyway because he believed it was the right thing to do. And I believed it was the right thing to do, and I honorably and faithfully reproduced what Bob said. I repeatedly contacted, to no avail, the people who clearly did not want to talk to me. The 3 players, Dick Broadhead, Roy Cooper. Nevertheless, I included, in what is clearly a not tiny book, in great detail, their points of views, all of the people